Frontline Freelance Register is the only representative body for conflict journalists organized by conflict journalists, and that's incredibly important because while our allies in the safety space like Committee to Protect Journalists, Roy Peck Trust, Reporters Without Borders, while they are our greatest champions of press freedom around the world, they receive funding from the industry, so they're usually very reticent to criticize individual news outlets, and we need to get to the point that we start naming and shaming abusive and exploitive news outlets that put our colleagues in danger in the field. So that's why we started Frontline Freelance Register. It was founded by 6 colleagues, myself included, primarily who were covering Syria, and we watched how our colleagues Jim Foley and Austin Tice and Stephen Sotloff and others were abducted, and because they were not on exclusive assignments, many of them were freelancing and streaming for multiple outlets, which is unfortunately the financial climate of the industry, that usually you do need to work for multiple clients on different platforms. But because they were doing that when they were abducted, these news agencies all pointed fingers at each other instead of really standing up and taking responsibility the way they would have for a staffer and the way we feel they absolutely should have. So we formed this union kind of in the wake of that. We tried to negotiate with the industry for about 2 years, and while we are in a constructive conversation now with all the major players in the industry, from CNN to New York Times, about more professional safety standards, they didn't come to the table until our colleagues were executed. So for us, we are incredibly frustrated and quite traumatized that it took that kind of horror to get the industry to even come to the table to talk about basic labor standards. So that's something we feel very strongly about, and while we're going to continue to be constructive with the industry, our priority is journalists, whether it's the conflict journalists that are in our organization, local journalists that we work with, and all the press freedom issues, because of course it's journalists, not the companies, that will sit behind bars when press freedom is not respected. One of the most helpful things that, and maybe I should explain what I'm saying about this safety process, because I think it's really important for journalists to know that this is happening. And while we try to advertise with the industry, I don't think it's as well known as it needs to be. Frontline Freelance Register and about 60 news organizations, safety organizations, entered into a negotiation last year after the executions of our colleagues in Syria. And the process is to get them to agree to essentially professional standards that would be, the not paying on time, not paying expenses in advance, all of these things that put journalists at risk, really, in the field, are things that we're advocating for. And then from their side, they're trying to professionalize what is now a huge climate for journalists. We have media activists, we have, people who are bloggers. The definition of journalism, journalist has expanded. So the industry is hoping that we get hostile environment training before we go to these areas, that we have insurance. Our argument with the industry is that the current rates that the industry pays are not conducive to those kinds of expenses. So we're working with the industry through, foundations and through convincing the industry to, at least pay for their own freelancers that freelance maybe once a month or something, very regular kind of strings, that they start paying for the hostile environment training, which can be anywhere between $3,000 to $6,000, that they, of course, cover insurance, and that they, of course, send expenses in advance, so we don't have to make the tough decisions that our colleague Jim Foley had to make when his expenses weren't sent in advance, and he decided to take a taxi instead of having a driver in a war zone. So we're trying to ensure that no journalist has to work under the same circumstances that we believe led to the abduction of our colleagues, and of course, the very painful outcome from that. So that's kind of the climate you're working in. But what we personally do and we advocate for journalists to do is, if you can, get a hostile environment training, hostile environment and first aid training. It's called a HEFAT, HEFAT, and there are many providers throughout the United States and Europe, and many of these providers are starting to work in other parts of the world to provide these trainings. And what they do is first aid, which is really, really important because most people actually die in car accidents, not in active combat. So many of these wounds, some of the most important American journalists, war reporters, Chris Hondros and Tim Hetherington, they died in Libya, not from combat necessarily. They bled out and had any of the people around them known first aid, basic first aid, how to essentially apply pressure to a wound, they could have been saved. So that's why first aid is incredibly important in these environments. The next is the hostile environment training, and that's just understanding really all of the worst case scenarios. So captivity, abduction, understanding kidnapping and ransom insurance, and really going through a risk assessment and thinking about the worst case scenarios and how to prepare your family and loved ones for that. So it's really putting together a risk assessment that includes all the information that you need in a very secure way, that would allow your loved ones and people that are part of your emergency plan to activate a strategy in a way that's least stressful for them. In Bahrain, we used Roy Peck Trust. It's a UK-based journalism support group, and they have a very thorough risk assessment plan and communications plan. And as again, we knew we were going into a country where we would likely be arrested and deported. So that's what our risk assessment included, and it was, I guess we would say it was successful. It was activated as it should have been. They changed the media blackout. Usually there's a media blackout for much longer than that is what I had asked for, but my name was leaked by Associated Press, so and the charges ended up being different. So my emergency contact made a call to release the media blackout, and I think that helped in that circumstance, but it's really case by case. So our risk assessment was essentially followed in a very diligent way, and we're again really happy for that. Our sources remained protected because of it, and we think it was less stressful for our families than it could have been, because they at least had a play-by-play of what we were doing, where we would be, and who they could contact.